Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, whenever you're watching this video, and welcome back to a new episode of At the Time of This Recording. I've been looking forward to doing this one for a long time now, and it was one of the first ideas I had when I decided to do these types of videos. Today, we are going to be rating and reviewing the discography of one of my absolute favourite bands, R.E.M. I've been a fan of R.E.M. for as long as I can remember. My first sort of memories of them was that my dad had a few of their albums when I was very young, and they, as a result, were very important to me growing up. Albums such as Document, Out of Time, and Monster, I distinctly remember him having, and as part of his own extensive CD collection, which I have since developed myself over my 34 years on this earth. The band themselves formed out of the underground alternative punk scene in Athens, Georgia, consisting of the enigmatic and distinctive vocalist Michael Stipe, the jangling retro guitars of Peter Buck, the melodic bass lines and piano and backing vocalist and a bit of everything, Mike Mills, and the grounded drumming of Bill Berry, who also contributed to backing vocals and the occasional guitar. Through a 27-year period of recording music, they have fascinated and inspired millions, including this guy here. When I was writing music, this band were a massive influence on me and one of my biggest inspirations. And it was the whole mystique and the lyrics set to a sort of distinctly vintage but also current, so in a way kind of like a timeless sound, really inspired my own journey into creating music. But you're not here for my ruminations, you're here for the ratings, and we have a lot of albums to get through, so let's crack on. Released in 2004, we had the band's 13th album, Around the Sun, in last place. The band themselves don't really like this album, as read up on in various interviews. It does sound like a band that has been sort of starved of ideas. They are trying new things, but it does sound very sort of disjointed and a little bit dysfunctional. Peter Buck himself didn't really hold back about his own opinion of the album by stating that he thought that the band sounded like they were bored. Stipe and Mills, on the other hand, have both said that the songs themselves were good, but sort of were victims of lost focus in the studio. I would pretty much entirely agree with both of these points of view. It is overall both boring and rambling. Not only that, but a lot of the chord changes feel very awkward and quite clunky and a bit, yeah, a little bit clumsy. From what I can understand, they were trying to experiment with this side of their musicianship. But when you listen to the jarring compositions of, say, Make It All Okay and certainly High Speed Train, you do sort of understand that point of view. That being said, there are some absolute gems here. The opening track, Leaving New York, is exceptional, as well as the track Aftermath, both of which were singles here in the UK. Leaving New York, I think, reached the top 5, but the Aftermath didn't really do so well. I did actually record a cover of Aftermath on my own YouTube channel, which you are more than welcome to check out if you so wish. There is also an instance of rap on this album, on the track The Outsiders, in which Q-Tip sort of wraps up the song in the last verse. I don't know how other fans feel about that song, but I actually quite like it. It's certainly not what a lot of the fans would have anticipated hearing, but as much as I hated the song at first, I have come to since warm to it a lot more. So the highlights for me on the album are Leaving New York, The Outsiders, The Boy in the Well, and Aftermath. I wouldn't, if someone, say, is looking to sort of get into the band for the first time, I would not really sort of suggest this album to begin with. I would suggest this much further down the line. But yeah, if you are relatively experienced with the band, it's worth checking out. There are some real highlights here, but overall it is more overshadowed by sort of quite average material. In 14th place, I have put the band's 11th album, Up, in that position, released in 1999. This album would be the first the band would release as a three-piece following the retirement of Bill Berry following his traumatic brain injury while on tour. Musically, it's very hard to describe or to pigeonhole. It focuses a lot more on electronics and textures and drum machines rather than the sort of the more typical jangly guitars and melodic bass lines we'd been accustomed to before this. If, however, you were sort of trying to sort of compare it to something, I would say it sounds a little bit more like the experimental side of Radiohead, say something like Kid A or Amnesiac. I love Radiohead, so this is absolutely not criticism. It is just more an observation of the change of direction that they went. The opening track is it's as flat as an opening as you would find in their discography. An Airport Man. Jesus Christ, what a whimper to start on. I mean, a statement, yes, it is absolutely a statement, but my God, it's so dull. It's incredibly minimalist. Again, I don't mind that at all. I don't mind the minimalism, but when you compare it to, say, the following track, "The Lotus," this is a lot more than what we would maybe expect from the band. It's a more sort of rock arrangement, but when you put the two together, it just feels really quite strange. It's this confusion is in what this album is that is the biggest weakness of it. The guitars take centre stage in Lotus Eater, but this would be the only song where that would really be the case. Peter Buck tends to embrace more acoustics on this album and sort of more sonic textures with using things like, say, the EBow in pretty much every other instance of the use of guitar. So when you've got songs like Sad Professor, Day Sleeper, and You're in the Air being on the more sort of gentle side of his playing, and then you've got the use of things like the EBow on songs like Walk Unafraid. With the sort of the guitars taking a back seat, the songs are more focused on keyboards and synthesizers. Hearing new sounds is always exciting, and the piano ballad "At My Most Beautiful" is exceptional. And it's got these sort of Beach Boys style vocal harmonies in the build up to the chorus, which is it just builds up perfectly. However, a lot of the songs do feel quite laborious to get through, especially Airport Man and the frankly weird Hope, which I find quite hard to listen to. So is it a rock album or is it an electronic album? Yeah. The highlights for me on the album are Suspicion, At My Most Beautiful, Day Sleeper, and You're in the Air. Again, it would be another album to suggest to those who are a little bit more familiar with R.E.M. before sort of giving them a shock to the system with this album. But yeah, a bit like Around the Sun, it does have its highlights, but they are a bit few and far between. So yeah, I would certainly say to check it out. Released in 2011, we have the band's 15th and final album, Collapse Into Now. This album would signify the end of an era, and the band calling it quits on their own terms. No bad blood, no drama, it was just that it was time to call it. As such, they wanted to create an album that bids the best farewell that the band could muster. So, what better way to do that than to basically combine more or less everything that they had done in their nearly 30 years creating music together. We hear a delightful mix of sincerity and the playful, the latter of which we hadn't really heard much of in the post-Berry years. The electric guitars that had been sort of lacking in their more later material are certainly back, and Stipe delivers exactly what's needed at the right time, and Mike Mills providing the spine and some delightful fills on the bass. If you thought the opening to Up was dull, we have a fantastic introduction in Discoverer, and this followed up by All the Best, which are two hard rocking songs, and Stipe especially sounds like he's having the time of his life. We also have plenty of the fun rock orientated songs in That Someone Is You and Alligator Automotive Autopilot. I honestly can't remember the name of that song, but it's four words and they all begin with A. They clearly haven't taken themselves too seriously here and made songs that you can tell that they just simply enjoyed writing and recording. But of course, as with any REM album, we have the enigmatic side. This is summed up best by the incredible song "U Berlin," with its detuned acoustic ballad and haunting keys, and also a bit of a deep cut is in urgent need of much more love. So if you take anything away from this video, I would certainly recommend you to listen to Berlin. And we also have It Happened Today with the sort of, again, more acoustic foundations before building up to a triumphant sounding outro. And then you've also got songs such as Oh My Heart, which has the feeling of a very old sort of folk song, and the closing track Blue, which Stipe returns to sort of more spoken word, which ends the album, and the career by reciting the title of the album, Collapse Into Now. You can definitely feel that the band were wanting to end on a high, and this album, in a way, is a microcosm of their entire discography, so it is the ultimate farewell from this band. That being said, it certainly isn't perfect, hence why it's rated down here, but nonetheless, it is a brilliant way to end an incredible career. And the highlights for me on the album are Discoverer, All the Best, Berlin, and That Someone Is You. Again, there are some real deep cuts here, which I recommend to any fan, both casual and a bit more familiar with the band. So yeah, definitely one to check out for me. Released in 2008, we have their penultimate release, Accelerate. This follows 4 years on from what was overall a fairly lukewarm offering in Around the Sun, and it is as re-energized and as refreshed as they had done in a long time. As you can hear from this album, they feel no longer on their last legs, with the return of the heavier guitars, as you would have heard on albums such as Monster and New Adventures in Hi-Fi. This newfound energy is obvious in the first few bars of the opening track, Living Well is the Best Revenge, with the overdriven guitar pattern, heavy chords, and fast pace. Another thing you will notice is that Stipe's voice does sound much huskier, but nonetheless it is performed with a lot more power than he has done in years, which complements the overall heavier sound perfectly. Songs such as Man-Sized Reef, Supernatural Super Serious, Accelerate, and Horse to Water, as well as the divisive closing track I'm Gonna DJ, very much follows this recipe of hard-hitting, energetic rock songs. Whereas the tempo dips slightly around the middle with The Hollow Man and Song for Submarine, providing some much-needed breathing space. That, as well as the arrangements that have sounds sort of reminiscent of their older material. There's a conciseness and cohesiveness with this album overall, which I appreciate a lot, considering the inconsistencies and the rather drawn-out prior releases of Up and Around the Sun. The highlights for me on the album are Living Well is the Best Revenge, Man-Sized Reef, Supernatural Super Serious, and Horse to Water. If you are more on the sort of the heavier side of the band, it is definitely one to check out. Released in 1988, we have the band's 6th album, Green. The album would be an indication of what the band would go on to do in the future, and also refine on future albums, with the combination of the janglier electric guitars, steady rhythms, but also a much stronger focus on acoustic instruments, and the introduction of the mandolin. This instrument, of course, would take centre stage not too much later in their history. As such, this album, Green, is a very experimental album. The opening track, Pop Song 89, has a significantly more upbeat tone and arrangement to what the band's previous album, Document, had to offer. And you also have the tracks Get Up and Stand, would also represent this more sort of newfound optimistic style that they would go on to perfect. The latter song would remain one of the band's most divisive singles among the fan base. I personally really like it. It never fails to make me tap my foot or smile. But what's funny to me about the song is that it was written as a bit of a tongue-in-cheek bubblegum style arrangement. Stipe himself said that the lyrics were just a bit banal and sort of nonsensical, whereas Peter Buck was a little bit more matter-of-fact and said it was the stupidest song they ever wrote. Kind of sums it up, really. The more emotional and reflective side to the band, however, are never too far away, and the likes of You Are the Everything, Hair Shirt being sort of fully acoustic makes the feeling seem a lot more raw. And of course, as I mentioned before, it would pave the way for acoustic offerings that they would release going forward. Of course, you've got songs such as the classic Orange Crush and Turn You Inside Out, offering a darker view into their songwriting and musicianship, respectively. Orange Crush was written about Agent Orange, not a drink in any way. It was written about the chemical weapon used during the Vietnam War. The foreboding lyrics are juxtaposed by the upbeat arrangement. And then, of course, you've got songs such as World Leader Pretend, that is written about a dictator and his refusal to give up power, despite his people saying otherwise. You've got the closing track, I Remember California, with a dissonant riff and heavier instrumentation, which is a really cool way to end the album. The album itself is a bit more reminiscent of what they would have released on, say, Fables of the Reconstruction or from Document. The highlights from Me Are the album are Pop Song 89, Stand, World Leader Pretend, and Orange Crush. Yeah, so this album would sort of see a little bit more sort of mainstream, conventional sort of stuff being thrown into their sound. So yeah, if you, it would probably be one I would suggest to someone getting into the band for sure, as it does sort of, yeah, it does encompass a lot of the elements. Released in 1994, we have the band's ninth album, Monster. This album marks yet another shift in their musical style. This one, in my opinion, more starkly than the band had ever done in their entire discography. The jangly guitars are replaced by heavy, distorted chords, and Stipe's vocals are grittier to complement this newfound direction. What we end up with as a result is a much darker side to the band that we hadn't really seen before, more akin to the more fashionable grunge acts that were dominating the airwaves at that time, as well as 70s era glam rock. The opening track, What's the Frequency, Kenneth, sets the scene. The song itself actually tells a real life event in which the American news anchor Dan Rather was attacked by the perpetrator shouting those four words over and over again. As we progress through the album, the sound doesn't really depart too much, which results in it becoming quite tiring to listen to. But what you can't deny is that the band had an awful lot of fun with some of these tracks. This would be evident when you hear the likes of Crush with Eyeliner with its tremolo heavy guitars and its sexy yet surreal lyrics, Star 69 with its whodunit style plot, and the playful songs Bang and Blame and Circus Envy. There are, however, some really intense tracks here, especially as we head towards the end of the album, with the penultimate track, Let Me In, written as an offer of support to friend Kurt Cobain, who would end up being found dead on the same day that the band began recording the album. In a very touching tribute, Mike Mills would actually play Cobain's own guitar on the recording. The distorted guitar is only accompanied by the vocal, which makes the tribute even feel more heartfelt and raw. And a fun fact is that Cobain's guitar was left-handed, but Mike Mills is right-handed, so he actually ended up playing the guitar upside down. There are breaks in the heaviness with the Everybody Hurts-esque love song of sorts, Strange Currencies, and the piano and organ-led Tongue, which showcases Stipe's higher vocal capabilities. These tracks do provide a very welcome relief to the almost suffocating and raw production. It does sound like the band at their most uncut and loose, but on a production standpoint, it's not the easiest album to listen to from back to front, hence why it sits down here. Despite this, there are times when no other R.E.M. album will do. So the highlights for me on the album are What's the Frequency, Kenneth, Crush with Eyeliner, I Don't Sleep, I Dream, and Strange Currencies. So yeah, I mean, it's a very different album to what they have done, but I love it for it, and I would suggest it to more or less anyone a fan of the band. Next up, I have put New Adventures in Hi-Fi in ninth place. The album was released in 1996 and is the band's 10th album, and it would also be the last one to feature Bill Berry. A lot of fans rate this album very, very highly, and a lot of lists I've seen rate this album much closer to the top. But for me, I just feel there are a lot of better albums in their discography than this one. It is experimental, but on the whole, it is inspired by the heavier sounds of Monster, albeit more refined, but dotted throughout are signs of what the band would maybe explore more deeply on future releases, as well as little sort of shouts out to their slightly more acoustic past, with sound effects and different instruments featuring regularly throughout the album. The band themselves said that they wanted to capture the spontaneity of their chemistry and would write and record a good chunk of the album while touring Monster in stadiums and arenas, which gives the album a very distinctive sound. The opening track, How the West Was Won and Where It Got Us, is a very minimalist track to get things going. It also has a very random piano solo, which sounds like it sounds like an unsupervised toddler playing it. However, this would be what the band would be sort of going for, according to interviews. It is a bit of a departure from what the band did a couple of years beforehand, but not entirely unheard from their previous albums. The subsequent tracks are influenced by various phases of their history, with the likes of Wake Up Bomb and New Test Leper stylistically taking the harder and softer edges of Monster, respectively. Meanwhile, Ebo Valletta is very similar to the spoken word songs from Out of Time. This song would feature one of Stipe's heroes in Patti Smith's, but unfortunately, she can't save this song. It is a dirge, 5.5 minutes. I can't really get back, unfortunately. When we get to the midpoint of the 7+ minute song Leave, it begins with a mournful acoustic guitar and harmonium before giving out to almost sounds like a blaring siren, which plays through the rest of the song for about 5 minutes or so. Buck once again using an ebo to play the main melody on the distorted guitar. All of this is actually quite brilliant when you put it together. It's just strange to me that it's in the middle of the album rather than either at the beginning or at the end. If it was at the beginning, it would have been quite a spectacular opening. The energy is retained as we leave with Departure and my personal favourite from the album, Bittersweet Me, before we reach sort of rock song cross honky tonk, So Fast So Numb, and the brooding country style track Low Desert, more along the sort of Automatic for the People kind of sound for that song, before we reach the climax in the delightful Electrolyte. This song especially is phenomenal, and it is an acoustic song featuring piano, violin, and also a first for the band, banjitar. If you don't know what that is, it's basically a guitar setup exactly like a guitar, so it's got 6 strings, and it's the same size as a guitar. It's just got a banjo body. So it has the sound of a banjo. It's just so you don't have to play it. You can play it like a guitar, play the same chords on it, but it sounds like a banjo. The song itself wouldn't have sounded too out of place on the likes of Green or Out of Time or Automatic for the People. The closing line, I'm out of here, always gives me chills, especially with what would happen to Bill. The highlights for me on the album are Leave, Departure, Bittersweet Me, and Electrolyte. So yeah, as I said, there are some sort of hidden gems here. It's certainly not their best album, but I feel it's certainly one of their more eclectic albums. So yes, there is a lot to get into as a result. In eighth place is Document, released in 1987, and it would be the band's 5th album. The previous 4 albums by the band have this mix of sort of retro guitars and introspective yet mysterious lyrics, but for the first time here, we see the band being more abrasive and in your face, both lyrically and musically. The grating open B string plucks and pounding drums open up the album on Finest Work song, and this almost menacing atmosphere would be a bit of a theme on the album, especially on the opening few tracks. The album itself would come out during the midst of the Ronald Reagan presidential era, and his deeply conservative and pro-war stances wouldn't make the band particularly happy bunnies. The result is among their most political material to date. A continuation of sorts, as the previous album, Life's Rich Pageant, would touch upon political subjects. Document, however, would have, of course, Finest Work song, and then to follow up that, you've got Welcome to the Occupation, which is amongst probably their most political song to date. Then you've got Exhuming McCarthy, and of course, the classic word salad, It's the End of the World as We Know It, and I Feel Fine, which showcases their songwriting credentials, especially when you can pretty much hear everything Stipe is saying now. Yippee. These songs, as well as the album track Disturbance at the Heron House, are up there with some of the best material from the 80s. However, these tracks are let down by some of the other songs on the album, such as Strange and Fireplace. The song Strange is actually a cover, which was performed originally by the punk band Wire. It doesn't really work with the rest of the album, in my opinion. It does, however, have a bit of a saving grace, as that it does sort of encapsulate the band's exasperation with the state of the world at that time in its own way. But Michael's nervous reference does give you a sense of breaking the fourth wall as well. So the highlights for me on the album are Finest Work song, Welcome to the Occupation, Disturbance at the Heron House, and It's the End of the World as We Know It, and I Feel Fine. And of course, not forgetting the one I love, which would be probably a bit of a breakthrough hit for the band in numerous countries, including in the UK. So yeah, the album itself is definitely worth checking out. As I said, the good songs are absolutely brilliant and would belong on any sort of REM greatest hits, if you like. But yeah, definitely worth checking out. In seventh place, I have put the band's 12th album, Reveal, released in 2001. After the experimental Up, I think that the band had made a more conscious decision to focus in a more specific direction. Up, in my opinion, was a bit confusing, but what we have here in its follow up is essentially a continuation of this. The keyboards still provide essential textures and ambience, but the guitars, for the most part, do the heavy lifting this time around. It is also a predominantly acoustic album, with electric guitars brought in more often than not for colour and for emphasising melodies, which kind of puts it in a sort of similar bracket as Automatic for the People, just combined with these electronic elements. Tracks such as the opener The Lifting, She Just Wants to Be, All the Way to Reno, and Imitation of Life still show us that the band never lost their penchant for a hook, be it vocal, lead guitar, or both. The band's newfound desire to explore electronic sound complement the acoustic guitars perfectly on this album. They aren't too dominant either, and they provide an almost heavenly atmosphere, with the likes of I've Been High, Saturn's Return, Beat a Drum, and the closing track, frankly odd, Beach Ball, barely feature any guitar at all, and are essentially entirely keyboard based. Nonetheless, they fit the album perfectly and don't stick out like sore thumbs, unlike those from Up. I do also need to mention the midpoint in the album, Disappear. The song itself is much more interesting when you consider its backstory. Stipe would befriend Radiohead frontman Tom York several years prior, and Stipe's advice would end up being crucial to York when writing the song How to Disappear Completely from Kid A, which actually happens to be quite possibly my favourite Radiohead song. Stipe's advice to York was to overcome his stage fright, would be to basically say, I'm not here, this isn't happening. A year later, Stipe would write Disappear about his and York's shared anxiety. This album is certainly one of their most overlooked in their discography, and it would be criminal to pass this one up if given the opportunity. The highlights for me on the album are The Lifting, All the Way to Reno, Beat a Drum, and Imitation of Life. So yeah, there's some real hidden gems here, and I would I would recommend it to anyone, quite honestly. So definitely check it out. In sixth place, we have the band's seventh album, Out of Time, released in 1990. And this would be the band's sort of commercial breakthrough on a global scale anyway. The band before this album were a hugely respected college rock act, but now they'd properly broken into the mainstream. The audacity of it! Absolute sellouts, said the gatekeepers, probably. My argument to that is it's the dream of every band to have success. And R.E.M. had released 6 albums before getting their big break. So it was a long time coming, and they had, of course, been known for a few years prior with the likes of It's the End of the World as We Know It, Orange Crush, Stand, and the one I love, reaching wider audiences. But Out of Time would be on a whole other level and would propel them into the stratosphere. The lead single, Losing My Religion, would be part of the soundtrack to the entire 90s decade. Overplayed? Yeah, of course it's overplayed, but it doesn't distract from the fact that it's an incredible song. And also is sort of unlike anything the general public had really heard before. It sort of brought the mandolin into sort of mainstream for the first time, probably since Maggie May. Ambiguous lyrics, but was also very accessible. It's an exceptionally rare combination, especially in this day and age. The album Out of Time, however, is so much more than Losing My Religion, and it does show many sides to the band. You've got the opening track, Radio Song, which is another track which is actually very unique in their catalogue, which features an MC alongside Stipe. Now, I can imagine that the hardcore fans at that time were absolutely mortified at what they were hearing with the sort of raps sort of dotted around. You've got songs like Low, Belong, and the sensational country feedback, which shows off Stipe's sort of poetic side and spoken word compositions. We have a couple of instances where the bass player Mike Mills would take the reins on the lead vocals. He would do so on Near Wild Heaven and Texarkana. This demonstrates the versatility that the band clearly have in their arsenal. Mills, in my opinion, is one of the most underrated bass guitarists of all time. He is the smoking gun of the band and very much the secret ingredient to what made the band so distinctive. I also can't talk about this album without another weapon that the album has in its arsenal. Kate Pearson, the utterly fabulous singer and one of the B-52s who happened to come from the same scene in Athens, Georgia that the band R.E.M. did. So they all have very much a shared history. And she would feature on 2 tracks, one of them being another one of the band's most divisive songs in Shiny Happy People, and the other one, closing track, and probably my favourite song on the album, Me in Honey. This is quite incredible, really, when you consider that the song Me in Honey only has 2 chords in it. And the highlights for me on the album are Near Wild Heaven, Texarkana, Country Feedback, and Me in Honey. Yeah, everyone knows this album from Losing My Religion, and as I mentioned, the album is just so much more than that, and I would definitely recommend that you listen back to this album so you can really appreciate what it has to offer. In 5th place, we have the band's 3rd album, Fables of the Reconstruction, released in 1985. The first thing you will notice once you press play is the very unsettling discordant guitar intro on Feeling Gravity's Pull. I must admit, when I first heard the song, I just didn't get it. I didn't like it at all. But given how much time has passed since then, it now ranks as one of my absolute favourite tracks from the band. There's so much unsettling atmosphere, even in the bridge when the tension releases, um, introducing a strings section, which also closes the song. It's a simply ridiculously good song. If you were to have listened to the previous 2 albums before this one, you would have noticed that the production is quite bright, but the comparison with this album is that the overall kind of atmosphere is very dark and very moody in comparison. The songs, a lot of them, are inspired by the South, by the sort of South of America where the band are from. So a lot of it is personal to them in one way or another. You've got songs like Driver 8, Can't Get There From Here, Good Advices, and Wendell G, which paint very vivid scenes either about the geography, the communities, local philosophy, and the characters that are painted deep in the region's identity. In spite of the darker production and sparser arrangements, there are still some of the band's classic jangly riffs aplenty. With the likes of Driver 8, Life and How to Live It, Green Grover Rushes, Maps and Legends. This proves that the band hadn't sacrificed any of their melody writing abilities, with brilliant guitar and bass interplay and memorable vocal lines dotted throughout. It also turns out to be a very enjoyable album. It's a slow burner for sure, but stick with it and you will be greatly rewarded. And the highlights from it for me are Feeling Gravity's Pull, Maps and Legends, Driver 8, and Old Man Kenzie. It is one of their more sort of overlooked albums, in my opinion, but it is exceptional. Very, very good, and a very unique album in their catalogue. So I would definitely recommend you check it out. In 4th place, I have placed the band's debut album, Murmur, released in 1983. Released to much fanfare and anticipation following their success on college radio, this album would continue to be the favourite of many fans all over the world, even over 40 years after its release. At the time of its release, there wasn't really much else sounding like it at the time. But for me, the closest it would probably be compared to would be the Smiths' debut album, which came out a year earlier. Both of these albums combine distinctly vintage-styled guitars, melodic bass lines, and instantly recognisable frontmen singing quite unclear and vague lyrics. Both also coming out at a time when new wave was everywhere, so refusing synthesizers was considered a bold move back in 1982 and 83. The main difference really was that Murmur was on the whole a lot more optimistic sounding, as well as the lyrics being much more ambiguous and also not being particularly audible either. Despite that, the songs here are incredibly strong and mature for a debut album. However, what you do need to consider is that these guys weren't fresh-faced or straight from forming to recording an album. This was a result of almost continuous touring and hard graft. Also, they had released their critically acclaimed EP Chronic Town the year before. Needless to say that the band knew exactly what they were doing and had refined their sound in time for this album. It certainly is a delightful mix of songs that flow perfectly from one to the other. Beginning with the classic Radio Free Europe. Do we know what Stife is saying half the time? Absolutely not. But do you care? No, well, you shouldn't. There are so many enjoyable songs on here, and despite its acclaim, casual listeners of the band may not really be all that familiar with it, or even be aware of its existence, which is criminal to me. And the highlights for me from the album are the tracks Pilgrimage, Laughing, Perfect Circle, and Catapult. Yeah, I would absolutely recommend this to anyone, but probably to those who are a little bit more familiar with the band. In bronze place, I have put the band's second album, Reckoning, which was released in 1984. Everything that I have described about Murmur on this album goes up an extra gear. The compositions now are much more sophisticated, the arrangements are tighter, the lyrics have more hooks in them, and also have a lot more emotional depth behind them. So you can also hear that Stife is slowly but surely finding his confidence behind the mic. The guitars on The Reckoning sound so much more full and lush as well. This would in large part be down to more layering and incorporating 12-string guitars into their songwriting. Songs such as South Central Rain and Pretty Persuasion benefit greatly from this, and the distinctive jangle is much brighter. Very sort of what you'd expect to hear from, say, The Byrds, for example. This would also help the bass pop out of the mix even further as well. Absolutely every single bass fill can be picked out, and as someone who has a real sort of obsession about trying to sort of pick out bass lines as a rhythm guy, um, it's an absolute dream to listen to. The highlights for me from the album are South Central Rain, Seven Chinese Brothers, Camera, and Don't Go Back to Rockville. I mean, there's so many good songs on this album, but those four certainly um, just hit the spot for me, especially South Central Rain. It's one of my absolute favourite R.E.M. songs, and it is absolutely one I would recommend to anyone. Released in 1986, so 40 years ago, we have the band's fourth album, Life's Rich Pageant. What we have here is an almost flawless demonstration of the fusion of the band's distinctive elements, whether it's the poetic or the political songwriting, and the melting pot of timeless mix of distinctly retro-style guitar arrangements, only this time with a bit of a layer of punk as well. What will also be at the forefront are the vocal harmonies between Stipe, Mills, and Berry. Their respective voices suit the musical style perfectly, resulting in occasions of if an Everly Brothers and John Mellencamp joined forces. Coming a year off the back of Fables of the Reconstruction, this was a seamless transition, with the darkness and more serious undertones from it carrying on into Life's Rich Pageant. The opening track, Begin the Begin, and following track, These Days, showcases this rougher edge very well with the open chords and memorable guitar intro. The third track, Fall on Me, probably ranks in my top 5 R.E.M. songs of all time. In under 3 minutes, we have a microcosm of the band's sound. Lyrically poignant, 3-part vocal harmonies, which doesn't really happen all that much, and a real earworm of a chorus. The unplugged version of this song as well could be even better than the studio version. It simply is remarkable. And what follows that is very much more of the same in terms of the quality, with the exceptional track Cuyahoga, which was named after the river that flows through Cleveland, Ohio. And it had been so heavily polluted that on numerous occasions it had caught fire. Stipe's lament and exasperation of how complacency show the character's memories of the river have been spoilt. Set to a classic bass intro, 12-string guitars, it's a gorgeous, bittersweet track. As we go deeper into the album, what's also apparent is that despite the more serious sort of themes, the band had not lost their sense of fun at all. You got the punky Hyena and the utterly ridiculous espionage movie theme styled Underneath the Bunker, which provides, both of these tracks provide quite a good amount of comic relief, which may be a bit jarring when up against songs like Fall on Me and Cuyahoga, but it does inject a lot of energy. We also get exposed to a little bit of sort of psychedelic sort of stylings of rock with the Flowers of Guatemala, and Heartland Rock with the utter banger, I Believe, with its really cool banjo intro. And I believe that was performed by Bill Berry. And last but not least, we have what almost sort of feels like a really sort of old folk song in Swan Swan H, H standing for hummingbird, which is actually quite a curious track. It's very mysterious, and whenever I listen to it, with the sort of the theme throughout, I sort of get this picture of almost sort of gold rush era or yeah, sort of saloon bars and what have you, with the acoustic guitars and marching snare throughout the track. The highlights for me on the album are These Days, Fall on Me, Cuyahoga, and I Believe. I feel it is another one of their albums which gets overlooked a lot, and it needs a lot more love. So do yourself a favour after this video and listen to it. Taking Gold, I have put the band's 8th album, Automatic for the People, which was released in 1992, and it was their 8th album. Right, I'm not going to try and gush or shoot my load over this album because it is one of my all-time favourite albums. So much so, I got the t-shirt. I mean, what can I possibly say about this album? It is a very dark album. It follows up from Out of Time, so it sort of combines a lot of those influences from Out of Time, which is very sort of acoustic orientated, but they've taken it into new territory with Automatic. You've got the opening track Drive, which is a really slow burner of a track, and introducing orchestral sections, so a really sort of dark cellos and violins to climax it. Try Not to Breathe, which is such a beautiful song. Try Not to Breathe. If I'm not mistaken, it was written about I think it was written about Stipe's mum, if I'm not mistaken. But anyway, it's a song about mortality and someone who just wants to be released from their suffering and to just end things in peace. Then you've got the complete other end of the spectrum with the Sidewinder Sleeps Tonight, which was a reference to The Lion Sleeps Tonight by Tight Fit. But it's one of those songs. It reminds me a lot of "It's the End of the World as We Know It" slash sort of "We Didn't Start the Fire" by Billy Joel, as that kind of combination, like really fast sort of combinations of words. The song itself, it makes no sense at all. It's complete nonsense, but I mean, we wouldn't be without it. And of course, we go back to the sort of the more emotional side of the band. We've got a couple of songs in Everybody Hurts and Sweetness Follows. Firstly, with Everybody Hurts, everyone says it's depressing. I would wholeheartedly disagree. I actually think it's a very uplifting song, and Michael Stipe actually backed that up. He wrote it about a friend who was contemplating suicide, and Stipe wrote it for him. It was basically a way for him to say that we all go through tough times, but hang on. It always gives me goosebumps, and as someone who has struggled with things like that, it's yeah, it's important. It's really really important to realise that there is hope, and there is also light at the end of the tunnel. And you got Sweetness Follows, which follows that, which again follows on this whole side of mortality, which would be the sort of the overriding theme of the album. Sweetness Follows, it's a really dark acoustic song, detuned, and a discordant solo around the middle. Yeah, splendid song, love it. And as we get sort of towards the midsection, you've got the likes of Monty Got a Raw Deal and Ignoreland, which are more on the political side. But then we've got the absolute banger in Man on the Moon, and then you've got Night Swimming and Find the River. I mean, that run of tracks, those three tracks, it could quite possibly be the best succession of tracks that, well, for me, it's without question, it's the best succession of tracks that R.E.M. have ever done. Man on the Moon, Night Swimming, and Find the River. Man on the Moon is quite interesting in the way that it's well, it almost never made it to Automatic for People. If I remember rightly, Stipe said that it was sort of written at the last minute, and it was then put forward and would end up to be a very popular song in the band's catalogue. Night Swimming is just a gorgeous track. Um, as Stipe so simply put it, it's a song about swimming at night. But it's it's goosebump inducing, that song. I absolutely love it. And for me, the chef's kiss is the oboe. I'm a sucker for. I'm a bit of a sucker for it. But yeah, the oboe, the two patches of oboe solo it's just gorgeous, and it flows with the piano beautifully. Mike Mills on the piano, by the way. It's just so beautifully melodic. It's such a nice song. And Find the River to close things off, which probably, with a gun against my head, is my favourite R.E.M. song. Again, I have done a cover of it on YouTube if you want to check it out, but I simply don't have words for that song. It's such a gorgeous, beautiful song. Watch the road and memorize this life that passed before my eyes. It's just such a lovely song. I can't speak highly enough of it. And you've got melodica throughout. And the strings, piano, and it sort of builds up to this wonderful sort of crescendo at the end. Um, and what you'd sort of realise as well with a lot of the songs on this album is that a lot of them don't really follow a simple sort of verse one, verse two, verse one, chorus, verse two, chorus, and so on and so forth. They all take on various sort of patterns, if you want to call it that, or lack thereof. And I think that's what makes the songs on this album so distinct and so unique. I mean, they have done plenty of songs like that in throughout their discography, but Automatic for People, I feel, has the most of that, if that makes sense. But as I've done with every other album in their discography that I've rated, I've got to choose four that I feel sort of represent this album the best. You've got Try Not to Breathe, Sweetness Follows, Night Swimming, and Find the River. I do intend to get the Sea Mine tattoo tattooed on me at some point with the as a testament to that album. It is so important to me in my own writing, my own material, and it deservedly takes gold. So thank you very much for watching, and I will see you again in the next video, and you take care of yourselves. Bye bye.